Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Fresh Light, our Wednesday night Bible study. Let me start out by asking you a question tonight, and that is, do you enjoy a good love story? My name is Mike Fisk, and I'd like to just tell you right here that I do. I love a good love story. A lot of guys say, no, they're, boring or whatever. They don't get into that whole romance thing. Well, that's not me. I love a good love story. My wife and I will sit down to watch a love story, or when the girls are home, we'll watch a movie. And most of the time, it's a Disney one or a Hallmark one. So there's always, plenty of love involved in that. One of the things that I've noticed about love stories is that there's usually four components to any love story. And I'm simplifying things a lot, but basically four. And usually every love story has some sort of a situation, some sort of a thing that is a tragedy. It could be a huge tragedy or it could be just a minor tragedy, but something happens at the beginning of the story or somewhere towards the beginning of the story that's a tragedy. That's a hard thing to deal with. Another thing that about all love stories, it seems like there's a villain involved. You ever notice that? Sometimes that villain is a thing. Sometimes it's a person. Sometimes it's an event or a situation. But something bad happens within the period of a love story. And then another thing about a love story is sometimes there's a surprise hero, a surprise unlikely person. You're watching the movie and you're trying to figure out what's going to happen. Is this person going to hook up with that person? Is this going to happen here? Is that going to happen there? And there's always that. And then all of a sudden, if it's a really good love story in a way, all of a sudden this unlikely hero, this person that you didn't expect to take place, comes on to the scene. And it changes everything, changes the whole story. And then, of course, the best part of any love story is what we all hope for, and that is the happily ever after. The prince rides off into the sunset with the princess. The prince discovers the shoe and fits it onto the right foot. The princess kisses a frog, and he turns out to be a prince. The princess weeps over the beast, and the beast becomes the charming Prince Charming. Love stories always have a happy ending. Tonight we're going to be talking about the book of Ruth. And we're going through the Old Testament if you haven't joined us before. By the way, if you haven't joined us before, welcome. And I'd love to have you share this on your timeline. Let other people know that it's here, especially if you have been blessed by the study. I'd love to have you here. I'd love to hear from you on that. Just put a little thing in the comment line. But we've gone through the books of the history and the books of the law, the first five books of the Bible. We went through Joshua, talking about taking the Israelites out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. We talked about Judges last week, and Judges were a horrific time in the time of the Israelites. If you remember from our study last week, Judges were a period of time where people governed themselves. There wasn't really any government as such, and they were always getting in trouble. If you remember the basic cycle for the Israelites in the book of Judges was rebel, repent, rescue from God, and then repeat. They just went back and over and go over. Most scholars believe that Ruth came towards the end of the period of Judges. We aren't sure who wrote the book of Ruth. A lot of scholars believe that it could have been Samuel, who was one of the last judges and also a priest. We're not sure of that. But the story of Ruth, to me, is just, like I say, one of the greatest love stories in the Bible. If you've never read the book of Ruth, let me encourage you. It's only 4 chapters long, so it's not long at all. Get an easy-to-read version of the Bible. It's in the Old Testament, right after Judges. Take a time to read that story of Ruth, because it's amazing. I'm going to give you just a snapshot of what it is. The story of Ruth is really kind of interesting because we call it the book of Ruth, but the story is really about a woman named Naomi. And Naomi and her husband had 2 sons. They lived in the little village of Bethlehem, and there was a horrible famine, and people were dying because they couldn't find enough food. And finally, Naomi's husband and her decided that they needed to do something to save their family. So they moved to Moab. Moab was enemy territory for the Jews, but they had food, and it was something that they felt they had to do to save their family. So they moved to Moab. That's where the tragedy strikes, because Naomi's husband dies. Her 2 sons marry 2 women from Moab, which is against God's law, but they did it anyway. And then the brothers died, and all of a sudden Naomi was left all alone in this foreign enemy country with nobody except for her. And we don't realize the severity of that because back in this time period, a widow, unless she had family members to take care of her, was hopeless. There was nothing that she could do. And Naomi was an old woman by this time. The chances of her finding another husband were slim, especially in Moab. And so she didn't know what to do. And finally, she makes the difficult decision to think, well, I'm going to die. But if I'm going to die, I may as well die back home with my family, or maybe somebody back there will take me in. She went from Bethlehem to Moab because of a desperate situation. Now she was returning back to Bethlehem because of a desperate situation. In fact, when she rides back into Bethlehem, walks back into Bethlehem, she says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because Mara means bitterness. Mara means God has deserted me." She was a completely hopeless woman. But the other thing about Naomi and Ruth comes in is Ruth and Orpah were her two daughters-in-law, and they were going to come back with her. And they start down the road, and Naomi says to the two daughters-in-law, "Why are you following me? I'm hopeless. There's no hope following me. Go back to your homeland. Go back to your families. You've got a chance to find a husband back there and to raise a family like you've always wanted. Don't follow me." And even if I could find a husband and have children, you wouldn't be able to marry them, which was kind of the custom of the day. Is that if a brother died, another brother or another close relative would marry that woman so that the family name would be preserved. And Naomi's saying, don't bother. I'm a hopeless case, so don't bother to follow me. Orpha turns, weeps, gives Naomi a kiss, and goes back home. But Ruth says to her, may God strike me dead if I don't follow you back. I want your people to be my people. I want your God to be my God. There has to be some sort of a story in the background that we don't realize here. There has to have been a situation in which Ruth, or Naomi rather, and her husband had taught her sons and their daughters-in-law about God and about what it meant to follow God, because Ruth uh, wanted to have that relationship with Naomi, and she wanted to have that relationship with Naomi's God. She was willing to leave everything that was familiar to her to go to enemy territory and take her chances with this old woman that probably didn't have anything going for her either. But Ruth loved Naomi enough, and Ruth loved Naomi's God enough that she was willing to take that opportunity. So Ruth and Naomi head back to Bethlehem, of all places. And just so happens, that was the villain there was death, but then the unlikely hero comes forth. Naomi was in a victim mentality at this point. Life wasn't good. She was sort of a Debbie Downer. She saw no hope whatsoever in life. But Ruth, I can't wait to meet Ruth, because I had a feeling Ruth was the kind of person that had the mentality of saying, if God gives you lemons, make lemonade. And so she decided she was going to do that. And they were hungry. They were starving. They had no income. They had nobody. They were just back into town. They had nobody to support them. And Naomi is sitting home dejected and depressed. And Ruth says, "Hey, I'm going out and I am going to find us some food." And the custom back in this day was that when the grain was ripe, when the rye was ripe, the gleaners, the harvesters would go through the field, and they would harvest the wheat, the grain, whatever the grain was, but they'd always leave a little behind for the homeless people, for the widows, for the orphans, for those that just had lost everything. And so Ruth went along, and just so happens, this is not a coincidence, by the way, she just so happens to approach the field of Boaz, a guy by the name of Boaz, and she is harvesting the wheat, or she is staying out of the way of the reapers, but whenever she can, she's going in and she's harvesting what's left over. And apparently Ruth was a very beautiful woman, and no doubt beautiful on the outside as well as the inside, because Boaz noticed her, and he asked, "Who is that?" And they struck up a little bit of a communication. Well, Ruth went home to Naomi with these sacks of grain, and Naomi said, "Wow, good for you. Where did you get this?" And Naomi said, "Well, I stopped at a guy's field, and he was very kind to me. His name is Boaz." And Naomi's face must have just brightened when she heard that, because here's the deal, and this is the beginning of the unlikely hero happily ever after thing. I just love this story. Can you tell? And so Naomi says, "Wait, Boaz? Do you realize who Boaz is?" And Ruth says, "No, I don't know who Boaz is. I don't know anybody here but you." And Naomi says, "Boaz is our kinsman redeemer." Now, remember, I said that if a son or a brother dies, that the other brother would marry the woman, or a close relative. Well, guess who the close relative was in this story? Just so happens, just by God's coincidence, I don't believe in coincidences, that Boaz was the kinsman redeemer. He was the one that needed, that Ruth and Naomi needed to rescue them. But there was a trick to, or there was a uh, some ramifications to it. Anyway, um, Ruth keeps going back to the field. They get closer and closer together in their relationship, and Ruth goes home one night to Naomi, and Naomi says, "Here's what you need to do. You need to go and make yourself available to him, not sexually." Not romantically, but just as a person, to let him know you're interested. And so she did that. You'll have to read the story to find out how. I'm not going to spoil that for you. So she goes and she lays at his feet, and when he wakes up, he promises her that he will marry her, but there's a stipulation here, and that is Boaz gives her some good news and bad news here. Boaz says, "I will marry you, but you need to realize that I can't marry you because there's somebody else that's closer to your family than me." So I can't imagine the way Ruth went home, like excited that this man that she'd fallen in love with wanted to marry her, but with the fear that maybe she was going to get stuck with some of the guy she didn't know yet. Well, Boaz goes to the city fathers, and he calls the other relative in, and he says, "Okay, here's the situation. Naomi's back in town. Do you want her land?" And the guy says, "Yeah, I'll take her land." And he says, "All right, good. But what you need to realize is that Ruth, the daughter in law, is here. And so, in order for you to get his land, you need to marry her." And the guy thinks about it. He says, "I can't do that." Boaz says, "All right." And he says to the city elders, he says, "You hear it? He doesn't want to do it. Ruth is mine, and along with Ruth is this land." And so here's the happily ever after part. Ruth and Boaz get married, and Ruth gives birth to a baby, and they live happily ever after. And can you imagine grandma time there for Naomi? Here's this baby, this grandchild that she'd always wanted, and now she was holding him in her arms. But there's more to this story, because it's really a cool story. Boaz, I believe his mother or grandmother, I can't remember exactly right now, sorry. Boaz's grandma or mother, can't remember, his name was Rahab. You remember back when the Israelites took over Jericho, they saved a prostitute who was a godly person, and her name was Rahab, and she gave birth to Boaz. Cool, right? But it gets better than that, because Ruth and Boaz have a baby, and his name was Obed. And he had gotten married, and he had children, and one of those children's name was David, King David. And if you look into Matthew, you see Rahab's name in the genealogy, you see Obed's name in the genealogy, you see David's name in the genealogy, and you see Mary and Joseph and Jesus in the genealogy. What a cool love story. God had it planned all the way along that here this poor woman who had no hope at all, and her daughter-in-law would land on the right field to meet the right person, to give birth to the right child, to continue on the genealogy. Because remember, way back in Genesis, God said he would bring a redeemer. And Matthew shows us all the way through the genealogy, God working to bring Jesus into our life. And that, I said Ruth was my favorite love story. Maybe it's my second favorite love story, because my favorite love story is what happened then, because that's Jesus. That's Jesus. So what can we learn about the book of Ruth? Remember, we're talking about grace here, because grace isn't just a New Testament thing. Grace starts in Genesis and it's going to end in Revelation. That's just the way grace is. But what we can learn is, first of all, we need to realize that even during our most tragic times in life, we're never forgotten. Naomi felt forgotten. She felt hopeless. Here she was in a foreign land. Her husband was dead. Her children were dead. She had nothing to hope for. And God saw her. No matter what situation you find yourself in, no matter how bad things are for you, realize God has not lost sight of you. You may have lost sight of God, but God has not lost sight of you. Don't ever forget that. The other thing about Ruth that I think we can learn is the power of unconditional love. Ruth loved Naomi unconditionally. She had no idea what was going to happen down the road. She had no idea she was going to meet Prince Charming and they were going to ride into the sunset together. She didn't know that. All she knew is two things. She knew she loved Naomi, and she knew she loved Naomi's God. And because of that, she knew somehow that things would work out. And guess what? They did. God's love for you is unconditional. It doesn't matter what struggle you're going through. He loves you and He wants to make things well with you. He wants a love relationship with you. The other thing to realize from the book of Ruth is that obedience pays off. Obedience pays off. Naomi strayed from God in a sense by going into the city of Moab, but she came home and she did what God wanted her to do. Ruth obeyed Naomi, and Naomi was basically kind of like God to her. And it paid off. Even though there was the struggle with everything else, it paid off. And I think that's one of the things we need to realize too, is no matter how much we struggle with life, eventually if we follow God, it will pay off for us. And the last thing is, we never know what our random acts of kindness will do. Boaz had no idea when he saw this charming young lady in his field that eventually he would give birth down in his birth line to the Messiah. Can you believe that? He didn't do it for that. He did it because he loved this woman. We never know how our random acts of kindness will affect people down the road. Maybe you're just going to plant a seed. Maybe you're just going to say thank you or hold a door open for somebody or help some old lady across the street. By the way, if you do that, make sure she wants to cross the street. But we don't know how those things will affect people down the road. So whatever struggle you're going through, remember that God hasn't forgotten you. Unconditional love will always be there for you. If you follow God, eventually things are going to work out for you. And lastly, be kind. There's a goofy little thing on Facebook. In a world where you can be anything, be kind. Well, that's kind of a God thing. Be kind to others. You never know how those acts of kindness will help others. Hey, thanks for joining us tonight. As I said, I'd love to have you share this on your timeline. Let other people know about it. We're here every Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. Love to see your comments. If the lesson tonight was beneficial and encouraging to you, let's close with a quick word of prayer. Jesus, I thank you for the story of Ruth and for the unconditional love, for the fact that it shows us that you see us no matter where we're at, and we can't ever get far enough away from your love, and I thank you for that. I pray for anybody that's watching this now or will be watching it over the next few days. If they're struggling with anything, I just pray that you'd help them to realize that you see them and that you want to make things good for them and that you love them unconditionally. I pray these things in your name. Amen. Hey, thanks for joining us tonight, and we will see you next week at 7 o'clock. Oh, by the way, if you don't have a church and you're in the Luck, Frederick, Cumberland area, Zion service is at 10 o'clock. Love to have you there. If you're far off but you don't have a church to attend, praise starts at 10. Check us out on Facebook Live because we'll be there at 10 o'clock to lead you in praise and worship. Thanks for watching.